Friends, welcome back. Today we're going to have a look at Mark chapter 13. We're going to have a look at the whole chapter. If you have a Bible, then open it up to Mark 13. If not, then listen along as I read the Bible for us in English. As Jesus was going out to the temple complex, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, look, what massive stones, what impressive buildings." Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here on another that will not be thrown down." While he was sitting on the Mount of Olives across from the temple complex, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign when all these things are about to take place?" Then Jesus began by telling them, "Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and they will deceive many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, don't be alarmed. These things must take place, but the end is not yet. For nations will rise up against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places and famines. These are the beginning of birth pains. But you be on your guard. You will be handed over to the Sanhedrins, and you will be flogged in the synagogues. You will stand before governors and kings because of me as a witness to them. And the good news must first be proclaimed to all nations. So when they arrest you and hand you over, don't worry beforehand what you will say. On the contrary, whatever is given to you in that hour, that is what you say. For it isn't you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. Then brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rise up against parents and put them to death. And you will be hated by everyone because of my name, but the one who endures to the end will be delivered. When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it should not, let the reader understand, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. A man on the housetop must not come down or go in to get anything out of his house, and a man in the field must not go down to get his clothes. Woe to pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days. Pray it won't happen in winter. For those will be the days of tribulation, the kind that hasn't been from the beginning of the world, which God created, until now and never will be again. Unless the Lord limited those days, no one would survive. But he limited those days because of the elect whom he chose. Then if anyone tells you, 'Look, here is the Messiah, look there,' do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will rise up and will perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. And you must watch. I have told you everything in advance. But in those days, after the tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not shed its light. The stars will be falling from the sky and the celestial powers will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. He will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the end of the earth to the end of the sky. Learn this parable from the fig tree. As soon as the branch becomes tender and sprouts leaves, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see these things happening, know that he is near, at the door. I assure you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Now concerning that day or hour, no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, except the Father. Watch, be alert, for you don't know when the time is coming. It is like a man on a journey who left his house, gave authority to his slaves, gave each one his work, and commanded the doorkeeper to be alert. Therefore, be alert. Since you don't know when the master of the house is coming, whether in the evening or at midnight or at the crowing of the rooster or early in the morning. Otherwise, he might come suddenly and find you sleeping. And what I say to you, I say to everyone, be alert. Now friends, Mark chapter 13 is an amazing part of God's word of the Bible, but it is also, in Mark's gospel, the most difficult part to understand. But I think if we really look closely at what the Bible is saying, we will see some big things that I think Jesus is trying to teach his close friends, his disciples, and is also trying to teach us. And the scene starts where the disciples are walking with Jesus and they say to him, look at these massive stones, look at this massive building, this temple. And Jesus says, do you know, these great buildings, they are all going to be thrown down. Not one of them is going to remain standing. And so then they leave the place where the temple is, they sit outside the temple on the Mount of Olives, and Peter, James, John, and Andrew, they ask him privately, when will these things happen? And you see, this question is a very important question, because when Jesus says this building is going to be thrown down, that basically means the end of the world is coming. You see, for Jerusalem, for Judaism, for the Jewish people, the temple was the very center of life. It was the very center where God was dwelling with his people. And so for Jesus to say that the temple is going to be destroyed, not even one stone is going to be on another, that is a very, very important thing. It is a life-changing event. It is the event that changes everything. It is the event that marks the end of the world for the Jewish people, for these disciples. And so they ask, when will these things take place? What will be the sign? How do we know when this is going to happen? And Jesus starts by, he doesn't really answer the question at all. He doesn't give them an idea of when it will happen. He says, watch out. He says, watch out, be careful. You see, there's going to be a whole bunch of things that are going to happen around this time. You see, people are going to start coming out and saying things like, I am he. They are going to pretend to be the people that are going to be raised up to fix the whole world. They are going to pretend to be like the Messiah. And Jesus says, watch out for those people. And then he says, also watch out for when you hear about wars and rumors of wars, and when you hear about big natural disasters. These things aren't really the end of the world either. These things are just the beginning. They are birthing pains. They are the small things that come before the big event that is going to come. And again, Jesus warns them. He says, but you need to be careful. You need to be on your guard. Because you see, what will happen in these times is in these times, people are going to not like you because you say that I am your king. You see, if we follow Jesus, if we are people who are Christian, people are not going to like us. They're going to be delivered over to the Sanhedrins, flogged in the synagogue, stand before governors and kings as a witness. And the good news must first be proclaimed to all the nations. You see, the Christian people around the world are going to struggle and suffer in this time because they are going to preach saying that this world is going to end and God is going to bring about the new heavens and the new earth. And the reality is that everyone in the world is trying to say that this world is going to continue. And so they don't have the same idea. And because they don't have the same idea, they're going to be hated. They're going to be persecuted. They're going to suffer because they listen to Jesus' teaching, because they follow and believe Jesus. Now, after saying all these things, and this is very important, he ends with, but the one who endures to the end will be delivered. He says, you need to keep persevering, you need to keep following me. He then starts to talk about the reality of this end of times event that's going to happen. And he says, when you see the abomination that causes desolation. Now, this is a reference to something that happens in Daniel chapter 9. The prophet Daniel talks about this. But the abomination that causes desolation is something that is going to be life-changing. It is going to be so big and so different that nobody will be able to stand it. You see how Jesus explains it? He says, for those will be days of tribulation, the kind that hasn't been from the beginning of the world, which God created, until now and ever will be again. These are big days. These are very, very big days. And the truth is that there are many people who disagree about what the abomination that causes desolation is. There are some people who say that in AD 70, after Jesus died and rose again, in AD 70, the Romans came and they destroyed the temple. They came and they took over Jerusalem. And that was the abomination that caused desolation, because remember, the temple is the very center of God's people, where God dwells and all his people are around. And the Romans coming and destroying it completely, well, there was never such a bad day in all of human history, and there never will be again. There are also some who say that this abomination that causes desolation, this is surely the fact that Jesus, who is the Son of God, is killed by God's very people. This is the most shocking thing that's ever happened. God's Son, God himself, is taken and beaten and whipped and crucified, is hung on a cross. And that is the thing that never since the beginning of the world and never again will be ever as bad as that. The fact that God himself was killed by his own people. Now, whatever we think the Great Tribulation is, this abomination that causes desolation, what we do know is that at the end of this difficult time that is going to be nothing quite as bad as this ever again, people are going to ask the question, well then, if the temple in Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, if God is going to destroy the temple, which is where he dwells with his people, then what is going to happen instead? And you see, from verse 24, I think Jesus starts to tell us the answer to that. He says, these events, this tribulation is going to be unbelievable. It's going to be cosmic. It's not just going to affect the earth, it's going to affect all of creation. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not shed its light, the stars will fall from the sky, the celestial powers will be shaken. It's a very big deal. But then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. He will send out the angels to gather his elect from the four winds and from the ends of the earth and the ends of the sky. Now, I think this is very interesting. Now again, there is a quote that is being brought, and that quote is referring to Daniel chapter 7. And in Daniel chapter 7, we see this Son of Man, who Jesus talks about as himself, is going to actually go to the Ancient of Days and is going to go into heaven. And as he sits at the right hand of God and he has power and glory, he's then going to send out his angels, which really angels are messengers, are people of God who are speaking God's message. He's going to send out his messengers to the ends of the earth. And I think basically Jesus is saying this is what's going to happen. After the death and resurrection, Jesus is going to rise and is going to be seated at God's right hand as the king. Everyone will know he's the king because he's seated at God's right hand, and then he's going to send his people, his followers, to go to the ends of the earth and preach the good news and preach the message. And Jesus is saying, well, it's a little bit like the parable of the fig tree. You see, learn from the parable of the fig tree. When the branches are ready and the sprouts and leaves are ready, then it's obvious that summer is coming close. When these things happen, it is obvious that the end of the world is coming close. It's basically here. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. And this is why Jesus then ends this section by saying, nobody knows when this is going to happen. Nobody knows the day or the hour. But you need to be ready. You need to be on your guard. Like a watchman in the Roman times and in the first century, there were people who stood at the top of towers, and their job was to watch to make sure there was no danger. They needed to know who was coming to the city. They needed to know everything that was happening. And 4 times here Jesus says, watch, because you don't know. The person might be coming, the end times, they might be coming now, or they might be coming at midnight, or they might be coming when the rooster crows, or they might be coming early in the morning. And he says it 4 times, talking about the watches of the night. And really, I think Jesus is saying, we don't know when the end of the world is coming. Only God the Father knows. But what is most important is not when it happens. What is most important is that you are ready when it happens. Because when it happens, there will be much that is going on. You will be deceived so easily. It's going to be the worst of days that no one has ever thought of before. But even in those days, the Son of Man is seated at the right hand of God, and he's sending out his people to preach the gospel. And the reality is that if you're a follower of Jesus, it is going to be very, very difficult. You are going to be hurt. You are going to be hated because you follow Jesus. And despite all of those things, the reality is that Jesus is saying, be on your guard. You can't afford to be one of those people when the end of the time comes, when Jesus comes and you are sleeping and miss out. That is not a good thing. The reality is that the end times are coming and you need to be on your guard. And friends, that is what Jesus is teaching us, just as he was teaching his disciples. The end of the world is coming. Things are going to change. God is going to bring about his new heaven and his new earth. Jesus is the king that is going to do that by dying on the cross. And the reality is that we cannot afford to be those people who are sleeping when the end of the world comes. And so we need, now that we know that Jesus has died and risen again and is sitting at God's right hand, we need to be those people who are waiting and who are looking and who are watching to know, to keep following Jesus and to be ready for when Jesus will return.